All right. G'day. Welcome back to Collectivitis podcast, where we dissect the disease that is collectivism. My name is Pietro. This is Floyd. How you doing, Floyd?
Yeah, I'm good, mate. How about yourself?
I'm good. We've got a guest again. We haven't had a guest in a few
Yes.
weeks, but we've finally got someone to talk to us about the looming, impending voice to Parliament, Indigenous Voice to Parliament referendum, which seems to be the talk of the town everywhere in Australia at the moment. So with us today to shed some light, hopefully on the issue, is Canadian-Australian law professor from the University of Queensland, who is also a contributor to the Australian newspaper and the Spectator magazine. He's spoken at CPAC and IPA events and is in general one of the best, albeit loneliest, voices for conservatism in Australian academia. So I'd like to welcome to the show Mr. James Allan. How are you, James?
Thank you, guys. I feel like I should get a baseball cap. I'm feeling a bit, I feel like I got to fit in with a baseball cap.
We've got to get you a Lions one if you're up in Queensland.
Make Floyd feel a bit more at home.
Cool. So the voice has been talked about in sort of every conversation, every other conversation that seems to be happening in news, on the media cycle, all the rest of it. And on both sides, there seems to be this kind of accusation of the other side being misinformation. And, that's not actually what we're saying. This is what we're saying. That's not actually what we're saying. This is what we're saying. Everyone accuses everyone of lying. There's all sorts of other interests that seem to be at play here. So in the broadest sense, in terms of, the basic, what is actually being proposed, what would you say, what is the Indigenous voice to Parliament to someone who has only tangentially heard about it being mentioned?
So firstly, I should let the viewers know that when it was announced and the polls were 70% in favor, I predicted in print it would lose because, there's three problems with it. It is effectively, it is a constitutional amendment referendum. So every country with a written constitution has a method for changing the written constitution. In Australia, despite what you hear, the procedure is actually one of the easiest in the world. So in my native Canada, the politicians decide. So if you want to change the Canadian Constitution, you need both houses of the federal parliament, one's unelected, and then you need 2/3 of the provincial legislature. So that's all politicians, and the 2/3 have to represent over half the population. For some matters in Canada, you need every provincial legislature to say yes, all 10 of them. Just to give you a sense of that, that's why no one talks about getting rid of the monarchy in Canada, because it's effectively impossible. You need all 10 provinces. Canada has 36 million people. One of the provinces, Prince Edward Island, has about 150,000 people. They have a veto. Now, just to give you a sense, the Prince Edward Island economy works on growing potatoes, and Japanese tourists who come to Prince Edward Island because there's a book called The Anne of Green Gables, which is on the reading list for schools in Japan. So the Japanese come to Prince Edward Island to see where Anne would have lived had she been a real person. She wasn't. And so that is a really hard constitution to change. The Americans have a hard one. Of course, you need both houses of Congress and 3/4 of the legislatures. So don't let people tell you the procedure here is you need half of your fellow citizens to agree plus one. That's at the national level. That is not a hard procedure. And then you also need the federalism leg where you need half the people plus one in over half the states. Now, again, there have been 44 referenda in the history of Australia, and 8 have succeeded, 36 have lost. And of the 36 failures, 31 lost because you couldn't get half your fellow citizens to agree. And what a lot of people, particularly labor collectivist types on the left, what they don't like is that the voters in Australia have disagreed with their desire to change the Constitution. The substantive outcome does not tell you how hard the procedure is. It's not a hard procedure. It's just that most voters have not liked the proposals being put up. So this is the 45th proposal, and it's the first constitutional proposal I've ever heard of in the Anglosphere world where they could do this without changing the Constitution. Normally, you change the Constitution to give one level of government more power or to take something out. They could create this voice body tomorrow without a Constitution, but it wouldn't be in the Constitution. Once it's in the Constitution, then the elected parliament can't do anything about it. And I think most people on the no side don't want to screw around with the world's, I think we have the 4th or 5th oldest written constitution. That's pretty staggering when you think about it. You know, Australia, when did Cook arrive? 1788 or something. We have the fourth oldest written constitution in the democratic world. It's not easy to have a stable, long-lasting written constitution. And you don't screw around with it because you want to do something that you could do even without amending the Constitution. And so effectively, there are three objections, I think. All of them are knockout ones. You've got a moral objection that this is going to deal in unequal citizenship and undermines the Martin Luther King ideal of, you know, you don't look at persons, you know, what sort of genitals they have, what sort of reproductive organs, or what sort of skin pigmentation. You treat everyone the same. You ignore characteristics they're born with. And this won't do that. No matter how you slice it up, a certain section of the population, representing, I don't know, 3-4% of the Australian population, will have special rights. Now, it won't be individual rights, it'll be a group right. But for many people, me included, there's something really wrong with that. So it's a moral objection. Then you get the political objections. It's true that in a formal sense, this will leave the design of the body with elected parliament, and they won't have to do what the voice recommends, right? But politically, they will. The odds are overwhelmingly likely that they will. And so when people say, well, that's the problem with parliament, they just don't have a backbone, because effectively what's going to happen is this body will be captured by activists. And so when Labor's in government, they'll see eye to eye with the voice on a lot of issues. And sometimes they'll think, I can't get this through, but with the help of the voice, I'll be able to get it through. So it's an asymmetrical problem. When the right side of politics gets in, the voice body and the rights, they won't agree on anything, or very few things. And this voice body is going to make it very difficult to get things done. Now, if Parliament has a real backbone and they really care about an issue, they could stand up to the voice body. But we're talking about the Liberal Party of Australia. So when I say the word backbone and the Liberal Party of Australia, we know that's just not going to happen. It's like we're lucky if they have the backbone of an amoeba. Forget invertebrates. And so the problem is that and at every chance he had, Albanese took the option that was the most vigorous for the model. So it's not just a voice to Parliament, but also to the executive. Every executive branch, tribunal and dipstick little body, the Reserve Bank, who knows what they're going to be offering their advice on. That's bad. And again, politically, if you're a voter, you're not a member of the Liberal Party sitting in Parliament. Why would you vote for a setup where you look to the future and you calculate the Libs are going to roll over on everything? Why do I want to put this body in? Now, you know, the response from the yes people is, but Parliament doesn't have to roll over. And I'll give you an analogy from my native Canada, because they changed the Constitution there in 1982. And one of the things they did was to really empower the unelected judges. And it didn't look like the referendum was, or sorry, it didn't look like the amendment was going to go through. So they put in this provision that said, if Parliament wants, it can override the judges. And the people who were really pushing to get the amendment through said, look, see, Parliament's going to have the last word. And it got through. And the day after it got through, the very same people started saying it's illegitimate for Parliament ever to stand up to the judges. Can't do it. It would be politically illegitimate. I think the very same thing will happen here. You know, people will go crazy if Parliament ever disregards what the voice says. And just to give viewers a sense, in the 41 years since the Canadian Parliament had the option to stand up to the judges, because they put that provision in the Constitution, they have never done it once. So politically, this is going to be a very powerful body, a fourth arm of government. And I think the likelihood of that is very strong. The third problem is sort of technical, it's legal, it's constitutional. But this is the first time ever out of the 45 referenda where they're proposing a new chapter in the Constitution. You just have to take it from me that a lot of the activism by our judges in the last 100 years has been premised on separate chapters for separate things. So we have separation of powers, jurisprudence. Indirectly, we have the implied freedoms. I would say the judges are just making these things up historically. Even though I like some aspects of the implied freedom, I don't think it's honest interpretation. And giving this body its own chapter is basically a quiet, implicit little wink to the judges to say, you can use this to do all sorts of things, guys. And everyone in the legal cast knows that's true. So it gets its own thing. They could have said, this is restricted to only matters that exclusively concern Aboriginal peoples. They didn't, so it's everything potentially. And there's a fairly high chance, I would say, not right away, but in the next 15 years, 10, 15 years, because if you look at the kind of people who are being produced by our law schools, you wouldn't say they're anything other than woke activists. At some point, the judges are going to turn this may make representations into a constitutional right to be consulted. Now, Parliament can still, disregard it, but they'll be able to slow things down immensely. Just think about trying to get a mining project off the ground in this. So sure, Parliament will have the last word after they jump through 27 hoops. So again, I think it's bad on the moral level, it's bad on the political level, it's bad on the constitutional and legal level. And the yes side points to former Chief Justice Robert French, but we can point to former High Court Judge Ian Callanan, or David Jackson QC, before he died, wrote a phenomenal submission. I haven't even gotten into the problems that this body would create in terms of federalism and the division of powers, because one of my colleagues just wrote a great paper pointing out we already have screwed up federalism in this country by always siding with the center. This will give the Commonwealth even more power to override the state. So if you're a federalist like me, that's another problem. So that's like a incredibly quick outline of the problems.
Well, let's get into more of them in a moment. But while we are still talking kind of broadly what it is, why do you think that? Because I mean, yes, I agree with all those problems. In fact, I'd even add a fourth kind of from a libertarian perspective. Even just the adding of any bureaucratic level is alone a reason to oppose this, point blank, irrefutably,
yes, I mean,
regardless
you're
of the
adding
reasons for and
more
against.
bureaucracy to a massive number of existing bureaucratic bodies. I don't know, what are there, like hundreds? I don't know.
Yes.
There's so many bodies. It's just not funny.
Already
Yes,
a public sector that is, already a public sector that is, only growing and outbreeding, if
and
you will.
nobody likes that
private
unless
sector.
they've got the $800,000 a year job themselves to advise people, how to clean their toenails or whatever it is they do. I don't know.
Exactly. So apart from adding that other level there, but I don't know that that's necessarily what the general population is. Why the general population is starting to turn away from the voice. As you said, it was extremely popular when it was first suggested.
But that's because I think the main reason is people realize it's unequal citizenship. And they keep saying, oh, that's just racist, but it's not. It is dealing in inherited characteristics and giving some groups, and it is dealing in identity politics and giving some groups special entitlements, special rights. And people see that now. And the claim that, well, Parliament doesn't have to do what this voice body advises, although our Prime Minister Albanese did say it would be a brave Parliament that stood up to them. Yes, it would, because you'd have the whole force of the ABC, the universities, all the people in support. Anyone stands up to this body, they're going to be standing up to the unaccountable elites, the kind of people who took us into 2.5 years of thuggish lockdowns. They'll be the people going crazy. And it'll never be a Labour government, because their views are going to line up with the activist cast. So it's asymmetrical. We would be relying on the Liberal Party to stand up for us. And again, if you think that's a good bargain, you're just basically devoid of 5 senses.
Yeah, no, I don't believe the Liberal Party would stand up for anything. And as Victorians and I mean Australians in general, over the last 2-3 years, we've seen that the Liberal Party has no backbone, whether they're in or out of power. They have no.
Mr. Pasuto is like a latter-day Abraham Lincoln. I mean, really, what can you say? You can tell I'm being facetious, I hope, here.
Yeah.
Just so nothing bad happens to him.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned there briefly, the problems with the Commonwealth having more power and relinquishing of federalist ideas. So what would you go into that a little bit more? What is the Voice's impact on that? What would be the Voice's impact on that?
So the argument my colleague Nick Aroni makes is that Australia already has adopted an approach to, so basically with a written constitution that deals in federalism, you're dividing up powers and you're hoping that the main argument for federalism is you satisfy more preferences. So in other words, if you imagine a unitary state like France and something highly controversial that divides the population 51-49, I'll make something up, prostitution, right? Prostitution in the US, if you regulate it centrally, about half the population isn't going to be very happy. This is a Scalia argument. But if you send it to the states, you're going to get different outcomes from the South and the Midwest than you get from California and Massachusetts and New York. And of course, there'll be people in Austin, Texas, who don't like the more conservative line, and there'll be people in upstate New York who don't like the New York liberal line. But you'll maybe satisfy the preferences of 75% of the population because you've delegated the decision-making down a level. And it's also federalism meant to have different outcomes to fire competition, right? So in Australia, when we talk about cooperative federalism, that's like a non sequitur. There's no benefits from cooperative federalism. The only benefits are differences, different tax regimes, different approaches to health, and you get competition and people can see that some answers are better than others. So our high court has basically gutted federalism in this country. We're the only country in the federalist world where the states don't have income tax power. And people think they're going to pay more, but you're not. You know, in the US, some states, Florida, have zero state income tax. Alaska, in Alberta, in Canada, I think the income tax rate is close to zero there, whereas in Ontario, Quebec, very high. Right. And each province, each state, each lander in Germany comes up with their own rules, and you know, people like it or they don't like it. We basically leave it all at the center. We have the most Marxist equality of outcome sort of division at the horizontal fiscal equalization payments, which nobody understands. Just basically, you can block fracking and you still get the other states' money. It's a terrible setup. We have the world's worst vertical fiscal imbalance. The jargon, vertical fiscal imbalance. And so already we have a very emasculated version of federalism. If the voice body comes in, you've got heads of powers enumerated in Section 51. This is what the center can do. Well, there's a pretty good argument that giving this new body its own chapter in the Constitution, you would be able to make the argument as a centralist that once the voice body has recommended something to the Commonwealth Parliament, that's like a new head of power. So in other words, they'll be able to make more inroads into the powers of the states. Now, I understand that people living in Victoria who lived through 3 years of Dan Andrews during lockdowns might not find that the worst prospect in the world. But long-term federalism does better. People, even in terms of, and this is very counterintuitive, but even in terms of the numbers of civil servants per capita, real federalist jurisdictions like Germany, Switzerland, Canada, the US, they have fewer per capita than unitary states like France. And people say, well, you know, different levels of government, surely there's more civil servants. No. And anyone who's gone to university at one of the sort of incredibly top-down Australian universities will understand that, 65% of employees at Australian universities don't teach, and they don't research. They're administrators. That's going to one-size-fits-all top-down setup. So there are real federalism problems. That's a third-order problem. You know, I think the main problems are the moral ones of unequal citizenship, the political ones of, I didn't mention a second political problem with the voice body, but I'm not a big fan of bicameralism, right? I think it's oversold in terms of what it does, but
sorry, what is that?
Bicameralism is when you have two houses of parliament.
Okay.
So you've got the lower house and then a really strong upper house. Now, Australians don't realize that in the democratic world, there's really only 3 countries that have a really strong upper house. We do, the Americans do, and the Italians do. The Italians are trying to get rid of theirs, Pietro, just let you know that. And the problem is, we have the most American written constitution, or we effectively copied the American Constitution, right? So on federalism, we opted for the American version rather than the Canadian version. And on bicameralism, we opted for the American version. And we have the same number of senators per state because we copied that from the Americans, right? And we have a capital city that doesn't sit in any state because we copied that from the Americans, right? The one thing we didn't copy from the Americans was how you amend the Constitution. We went with the Swiss, and we didn't buy their Bill of Rights. And I think both of those calls were right. But the thing is, if you win an election in Canada, the upper house isn't elected. It doesn't block anything. And I'll pick a ridiculous example. Let's say you wanted to cut the deficit, cut spending. Well, you win an election in Canada, you just do it, right? You don't have to worry about the upper house. Same in New Zealand, same in Britain. Here you win an election and you've gone to the people with a manifesto, and you then go to try to cut spending, and you have to bargain with someone who's got an extended family in Tasmania, lots of friends. So they're a senator from Tasmania, and they just say no.
Yeah.
So it's hard to get things done in Australia. Yeah. And with this voice body, you're going to have like a third hurdle. So basically, anything that involves cutting spending or doing anything that the sort of activist class doesn't like is going to be very hard to do. And that's another political problem this body's going to throw up.
And do we know what the composition of the voice is going to be like? Is it going to be the activist body? Is it going to be elected? Is it going to be chosen by whoever's in power? What's the...
Nobody knows. Nobody knows. Okay. They're going to sort that out after. Parliament will decide after. With the polls where they are, that's why Mr. Albanese, who never said this at the beginning, in the last week or two has said, oh, it'll be bipartisan. The Parliament, he won't just ram down a model that the Libs don't like. But again, there's nothing binding on him. And it's very odd to be voting for something where you have no outline at all. You have no idea what's coming. I mean, sure, I understand that there are arranged marriages in the world, but this is effectively what that's like. You don't get to see anything up front. So I think that's another sort of crazy aspect of this.
From a constitutional perspective, let's just say that the voice is good and it wants to pass in a certain world. Should it have more of those provisions put into the constitution as opposed to just the voice to Parliament?
Look, I think it's really disastrous, but if it did get passed, which God help us, it doesn't, it's probably better not to have any details, because at least Parliament then, if it's a total disaster, you can't get rid of it, but you could maybe fool around with some of the details. But I mean, nobody really believes that very many people are going to be on this voice body from outback Queensland. They're going to be... This is a proposal that's overwhelmingly been designed and supported by the university caste. And if you were a betting person, you would bet that the kind of people who are peopling this voice body will be people from the university caste. Okay. I would put money on that.
Yeah.
No, don't know for sure, but that's would be my guess.
Yeah. Reasonable assumption.
Yeah. So I've heard you talk in the past about Brexit, and I think about how positive it was that Brexit that the vote was successful. What was it in 2015, 2016? Yeah. Which
were you guys born then? I think you were, right?
I don't know. I don't know if I was talking.
Probably were. Oh, sure.
And I would like to hear if you think there are very many parallels between Brexit and the Indigenous Voice to Parliament, because while superficially they may seem like entirely different things, both referendums, and I find a lot of the language around the accusations for the no vote, or in their case the leave vote, are exactly the same things being accused. You are a racist, you are a xenophobe, you are uneducated, you are this, that, and the other. So it's interesting
that those are why I'm not voting for this, but I'm pretty sure there's other reasons why the majority of Australians aren't voting for it. Look, incredible similarities, lots of analogies. The main similarity between the Brexit vote and this one is that on one side of the debate, you could line up all of the great and the good, the churches, the leaders of the corporate world, most of the politicians, the corporate class, the charities, all on one side. The bureaucracy, the legacy media, they are all on one side. And on the other side is just your average Joes. And so in terms of money, way more money was spent on the Remain side than on the Leave side. On this referendum, it's the first one ever, and Albanese patently gamed this, where they haven't, government hasn't supported both sides financially. The first contested referendum ever. And so he just relied on the corporate class because he knew they were going to send money to the yes side. So the yes side's got what, $100 million? That's shareholders' money sent by the corporate elites. They're not giving their money, they're giving their shareholders' money. And I know, because I know some people on the no side has about 5 or 6 million. Right. So we're being outspent, what, 15 to 1, something like that. I don't know. That is very similar to the Brexit referendum. The alignment of sort of the Hillary Clinton deplorables on one side and all of the social elites, the great and the good, the sort of latter-day aristocracy on the other, that's incredibly similar. I think another similarity, and this is a hostage to fortune, is the elites are going to lose this one too. Here's a further similarity on terms of the right side of politics. In Brexit, Tory voters were about 3/4 leave, 1/4 remain. And yet their elected representatives, so the MPs who were Tories, were about 3/4 remain, 1/4 leave. Look at the Liberal Party in this country. The polls vary, but something like 70, 80, more than 80% of Liberal Party voters are for no. And, you had to take the Liberals kicking and screaming to get them to support no. It wasn't quick. At the state level, lots of the Libs and the party have come out for yes. Just look at the state parties, and even ones, they changed their mind in WA on the light of the polls. But you've got, Pasuto finally came out in Victoria and said no, but he's not going to campaign. He's not going to campaign, but he's going to say no because he's read the. So there's so many Liberal MPs. At the federal level, it's a little better, but we've got significantly prominent Liberal MPs who are for yes on this. And so you've got that analogy too. In other words, the elected MPs do not represent their core voters. And that is another analogy with the Brexit vote. And, I hope we don't get a further analogy, because after the Leave Party won, the Tory party in Britain basically sold Leave down the river. They made it very hard to actually accomplish. I'm a bit worried that I think we're going to win this coming Saturday. It's 5 days away. But if we win it, I hope the Liberal Party and Prime Minister Dutton don't lose the peace. You can lose the peace. I mean, this has got no responsibility from the no people. This was an incredibly divisive proposal. It deserved to lose. All of the fault for any division is with the people who proposed this radical change. And nobody on the no side should bear any responsibility at all for turning down an incredibly divisive identity politics sort of proposal. Now, whether the Libs stand firm and say that, and say we bear no responsibility for this, this was a terrible proposal put forward by an incredibly divisive prime minister. Well, I'm not 100% confident they'll hold the line on that, but they should.
Well, wasn't there talk, and I don't know if this is still the case, I might not be up to date, but wasn't Dutton saying almost immediately that he would then push to have the voice not as a constitutional amendment?
Part of the problem is, and this is no offense to you guys, but he's got 25-year-old advisors in his office. People who go through university and they become Liberal Party politicians at university. And why anyone would listen to those people, again, no offense, guys, is completely and totally beyond me. So he's been pretty quiet about it, Dutton, since he got the blowback. When this loses, of course, there would be no chance at all of the Liberal Party putting up a second referendum just for recognition. I mean, what a stupid proposal. I like Dutton. I think on balance, if you're on the right side of politics, he's the least bad choice on the table with any chance of winning. I don't say that he's great, but he's miles better than most of the other options. And I know he's dealing with a party room that's just diabolically divided. But, he's really got to be quiet and stop saying that we're going to have another. I can almost guarantee there will not be another constitutional referendum if this fails anytime soon. And nor should you be proposing one. The good thing about this, if it fails, which I think it will, is that Albanese has gone for such a radical extreme model that he's basically crushed more moderate proposals would still be bad. And they would have a much higher chance of getting through. So in a way, this radical hardline proposal is taking those off the table too. And Mr. Dutton really has to be quiet. He has to go and get some advisors in his room who have, gotten out of their 20s.
Yeah,
So-
I mean, we take no offense to you saying that no one should listen to us,
definitely
because
not.
very few people actually do listen to us, so it's all good.
And in fact, I don't really care if people take offense to what I say anyway. So
Awesome.
it doesn't really matter to me whether you take offense or not. So
Welcome to the podcast.
Yeah. But what I was going to say was, I think it showed from Dutton and whoever was around him, like a complete misunderstanding of why the no vote was actually starting to grow, because it was this push. Not only is it incredibly divisive, but it was almost like in the same sort of effect that the Trump effect to a much smaller scale. The more these corporations and governments and people who talk down to you try to moralize to you and tell you, you have to do this thing, the more the average person kind of turns away from it. And like Dutton's seeing the no vote rise in the ranks and thinking, hold on, this is actually coming from a place of they want it in a different way. It is a complete misunderstanding of where the energy from the no vote comes, in my opinion.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I think the problem is his advisors say we have to offer something positive. The same way that a lot of conservatives said, Abbott could never win as an opposition leader because he's totally negative. But that's the job of an opposition leader. Your job is to oppose. And I think you have gotten why people don't like this, although I would also add, I think they don't like the unequal citizenship. And so the idea that you, in the course of a contested referendum, would start throwing out harebrained alternatives that are never going to get through the party room anyway, to be honest, and you haven't thought about any of the details, it's just stupid. And if you had people who were a little more hard-nosed about the politics of it, they would say to him, you don't have to offer anything. Your job is to oppose a really bad referendum. When you get into office and you feel that you want to, you go ahead, but that once you get into office, you're not going to have any desire to do this. Once I can tell you, he's not going to. So really what he needs to do is not to talk until he's consulted with people who are over the age of 28 in his sort of advisory team. And again, I agree with you. The extent it was Dutton, I suspect it was more the advisors. There's this immense sense that, we have to offer something positive or we'll be seen as negative. Well, who cares? You should be negative when the proposal is one of the worst constitutional proposals in 120 years. Of course you should be negative. And it's not your job to try to fix what is just, a steaming pile of horse manure. You shouldn't be trying to fix that. So yes, I would agree with you. Mr. Dutton should just stop talking about alternatives. Nothing he offers is going to help. Basically all the work's been done by Jacinta Price. She's been magnificent.
Yeah.
And would it be the reason why the Liberals aren't listening to their base? Is it just because of the advisors, or is it something else that they're looking to achieve?
Look, I don't really know the answer to that. I have some theories. One theory is we have a very unique voting system for the House. So, the old voting system that was established in Britain and percolated through most of the Anglosphere is called first past the post. So when you vote in Canada, there's 10 names on the ballot paper. You go in and you tick one. That's it. That's your vote. And whichever candidate gets the most, it's like a horse race, first past the post. So you can win with 38% of the vote. Someone else is at 37, all the way down. And then the alternative that grew up after that were these proportional systems, which I don't like, where they aim to get, in the final parliament, you aim to get the same percentage of the party as people who voted for the party, right? First past the post is a majoritarian voting system. It delivers a majority. Even though you don't get over 50% of the vote, let's say you get 42%, it's usually a landslide. And the problem with proportional voting systems, there's many, but the core problem is all these parties go to the voters with their manifestos, with their party, pledges, and none of them has any chance of getting over 50% of the vote. So they know going in that nothing they promise the voters will actually have to be delivered. All the bargaining takes place after the election between the elites, out of the view of the voters. And there's no way to avoid that. So again, we all know, anyone who's done economics knows that human beings are always in the game of trade-offs and compromises and picking the least bad option. And I really don't like proportional voting systems because all of the coalition building is done after the election, with first past the post is done before the election. So our voting system is preferential, ATV, sometimes called AV, sometimes called the deferred choice or something. I can't remember, whatever they call it in Alaska, but it's all the same voting system. We have it, some South Pacific island has it, and the state of Alaska has it. That's it. And it's a majoritarian voting system, but what you do is you just number all of the candidates from one to the last one. And so what happens is, at some point on your ballot, because you keep dropping off the lowest person and you redistribute his or her votes, at some point in your ballot, you must choose between the two established parties.
Mm-hmm.
And in 2015, people said, "Oh, I didn't vote for the Liberals because I was mad about them knifing Abbott and putting Turnbull in." And I'd say, "So where did you put Labour? Where did you put the Libs?" And they said, "Oh, I didn't put the Liberals until number 4." And I said, "Where'd you put Labour?" 5. I said, "Well, you voted for the Liberals." It doesn't matter where on the ballot, right? And so it's like a protection racket for the two main parties. That's why it won't change, because both parties benefit from it, right? To vote against your side of politics, you have to preference Labour above the Liberals. I did that in 2015. I put the Greens last, the Liberals second last, Labour third last, and then it didn't really matter about that. I just did it by random. And so our voting system forces you to pick between the two main parties, and it's very hard to punish them. In first past the post, you just punish them by walking in and voting for a little party. Has no chance of getting elected, but your side of politics really feels it quickly. There was an election in Canada where the Conservatives had a majority. It was like 280 seats in the Canadian House of Parliament, and Brian Mulroney's Tories had about 168 of them. And the base got so offside with Mulroney that at the next election, they went down to 2 seats. 2! They went from a majority to 2. That's how you punish your side of politics. You cannot punish your side of politics with preferential voting, or the punishment is very, very, mild. So already the two main parties in this country are down at really low levels of first preferences, historically low. And they don't really care. They don't care because they know that you punish your party in proportional voting systems by voting for someone else, and you punish your side of politics in first past the post by voting for someone else. But in preferential voting, you can't vote for someone else in the real core sense that matters, because you have to preference your side, the two big. And so you've got this horrible voting system that makes it very hard to punish your side of politics. So it's hard to control. If you're a right of center person, it's hard to control the Liberal Party, and they know it. In other voting systems, you can punish them. There's 700,000 members of the Conservative Party in Canada. In Australia, the Liberal Party has about 20,000. Now, Canada's 50% bigger in terms of population, but that would make 30,000, not 700,000. So we've got a problem here. And to that extent, I don't think the Liberal Party MPs really care what the base says. The Mark Textor strategy is to park yourself a centimeter to the right of Labour and say, well, who else are you going to vote for? You got to pick between us. That's the problem.
I remember the fallout of the federal election, catastrophic, and the fallout of the state election here in Victoria not long after it, catastrophic for the Liberal Party on both counts. And you would think that anyone who's in touch with the base a little bit is aware of the fact that the base wants you to actually make some sort of opposition to what the socialists and communists are getting away with. And I remember on the night of, I think it was the state election, straight away the Liberal sort of talking points on the election feed was, well, the Liberal Party, we're going to have to move further to the left now to recapture the cities. That was the reaction. It was like absurd.
Stupid. It's absurd.
How out of touch would you need to be?
So that's why I despise Dan Andrews as a thug. I think how he ran COVID, even before COVID, he was heavy-handed, but weaponized the police. I despise the man and the party in Victoria. But here's the truth: I would spoil my ballot before I voted for John Pasuto. That's how bad things are. All you have to do is have someone who looks like he's got a sort of a vertebrate somewhere, and I'd probably thankfully I don't live in Victoria, but if that's the best the Libs can offer, a guy who punishes a woman for not wanting, biological women to be able to compete in their own sports events, there's something wrong with the guy. And he doesn't even take 2 seconds to discover what's actually going on at a rally. So I just could not vote for Pizzuto. And that's the problem. The Liberal Party is choosing leaders who don't represent what the base wants. Simple as that. At the state level, it's really bad.
Yeah, I think down here it would have helped if the Liberals had have said something, because we didn't really get anything from them. It was just, when are you going to stand up? Even election time, you're just waiting for the Liberals to come out and say something. So it's kind of obvious that they were going to lose. It was just how in the upper house is it going to make up?
Yeah, I mean, if you'd had been a bit brave and been the sort of, oh, can you guys see me? Yeah. Okay. Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay. If you've been a bit brave and stood up to the COVID authoritarianism, you'd have been rewarded. Ron DeSantis was great in Florida. He barely won in 2018. He won by 10,000 votes or something. And in the last election, he won by 20 points. It was the biggest Republican win in Florida's history because people rewarded his bravery. Now, of course, to be brave, you have to be moderately intelligent. You have to read the data. You have to know what the facts are. Because at the end of the day, had we been living through the Black Death, where every third person dies, of course you can justify heavy-handed stuff. But it was obvious from day one pretty much, that young people had about the same risk as they did from the flu. And there was plenty of top-level epidemiologists saying that. And it was obvious that we weren't all in this together, and that older people were much more at risk, and that the Swedish approach of focused care was the way to go. That was obvious pretty early on. And, they just couldn't be bothered. They didn't want to take on the public health cast. They were too dumb to actually learn the facts and be able to articulate them. And so now they're not being, rewarded. They should have been rewarded, but they're not being rewarded. And I personally want to see all the politicians who did that to us, pay some sort of electoral penalty. And we're not really seeing that, which is really disappointing to me.
Well, they can give their reparations for the Indigenous then.
Yes,
come out of the politicians'
It's always easier
pensions.
to spend other people. It's always easier to spend other people's money.
So on that, so on Pizzuto being spineless and even throwing Moradimi under the bus and all of that. Why do you think so? To get back to the voice, why do we think that all of these so the corporations, the powers that be, your Qantas, Coles, Telstra, the big four banks, all of these sort of hubs of supposed capitalism, which in reality we all know is crony, and even all the along the same cultural lines, every time something like this comes up, be it Brexit, be it COVID and lockdowns and the vaccine mandates or whatever, be it the voice to parliament, be it whatever else is happening, it always seems to fall along the same cultural lines. The same people who moralize about this certain thing, you can almost guess for certain that they're going to be on this side of this particular issue. So I suppose the broader question is, why do you think it is that even for the average person who doesn't think that they are propagandized, why is it that they always fall along these same cultural lines on every time there's an issue that is, like, on its surface supposed to be something different and unique and taken on its own merits?
So I think there's probably many, but I can give you 3 causes. One is that people think that rich people vote right, but they no longer do. In the Anglosphere, this is statistical in general. There are obviously exceptions.
Yeah.
But wealthy people now vote left because left-wing parties have stopped being redistribution of wealth, sort of old-fashioned union type parties, Dennis Healy type, and they have become human rights barristers, left-wing type woke causes. And so I think in 2016, in that election, Hillary Clinton took the 100 wealthiest counties. Boris in 2019 with his landslide, he lost all the constituencies where the super wealthy live. So as a class, speaking in general terms, rich people now vote left. People forget that. Once you're running one of these corporations making 10 or 15 million a year, you want to be able to go to your dinner parties and you share these sort of again, I generalize, sensibility. So partly it's just the way they think. Partly there's obviously some backroom stuff going on. I mean, it wasn't all that long after Qantas painted a couple of planes yes, and it started giving money to the yes side that the Albanese government decided that they were going to limit Qatar Airlines landing slots. So, now I have a little more respect if it's just straight out a business deal where Qantas realizes, look, I'm going to get something great if I just go along with the government. I don't like it, but at least we can all sort of go, okay, well, personally, I think you can respond to that if you were on the right side of politics by just saying, and I wish Dutton would do that, by saying these corporations took sides on a party political contested referendum. They sided with one side of politics over the other, and we will respond accordingly when we get back into office. For instance, we will move most of the government flights from Qantas to Virgin. You just make that clear you're going to do that. I mean, even worse than the big companies giving money to the yes side might be the charities. Charities, you give money to charities, supposing they're going to spend the money according to their charitable purpose. Well, the charities gave what? Gary John says $18-20 million to the yes side. I would never give a penny to any charity. From now on, I'm going to ask if they gave any money to the yes side, because I don't see any reason why anyone should be giving the money. And that includes the universities. 42 universities, over half have come out officially for yes. How many do you think officially came out for no?
Zero,
yeah. Rhymes with the fifth Roman emperor. Good call there. And even the neutral ones, even the ones where the Senate decided not to take sides, they were running information sessions with wall-to-wall yes people. I mean, go and look at the University of Sydney. They did come out for yes. But these aren't neutral, balanced sort of information sessions. They're just propaganda. And you brought up early on this idea of disinformation. Again, disinformation is a very hard idea to cash out. I mean, I did my doctorate on Hume. So you can disagree about the world of fact, about whether the vaccines work or not. That has become politicized. When you move from the world of fact, because remember, something upwards of half of the articles that show up in Nature now can't be reproduced by later researchers trying to. So you've got a reproduction crisis. There's a different word. It's not reproduction, but it's the idea of, running the same experiment and getting the same results, and they're having a really hard time doing that. And the world of fact is, it's contested. Now, obviously, I believe there's a mind-independent truth imposed on us. But in some areas, it's quite complicated. It's multifaceted, and there's lots of causal factors. And so you hand over to this body of what are propagandists, and they look for the most sympathetic left-wing interpretation of the facts. I wouldn't pay any attention to them. When you leave the realm of fact, the external causal world, that gravity is imposed on us, and you move to the social science aspects where human beings are involved and evaluative judgments are being involved, it's even more laughable. So when they say there's been disinformation over the Voice, they cite the RMIT fact checkers, who all they do is cite the expert panel, all appointed by Albanese, not a single skeptic appointed. And, okay, sure, there's former Chief Justice French on the yes side, who is on the High Court, but Ian Callan was on the High Court, and he takes the polar opposite view. RMIT doesn't cite that, and they don't cite David Jackson. And, they say, well, most university public law academics are, they say they're for yes, and that this won't be a problem. Yes, but they're all left-wing, Viewpoint diversity has collapsed on universities. So the fact checkers are just, in my view, largely propaganda machines. And there's no reason to think, even in the world of fact, where you're dealing with a mind-independent true answer, usually it's a fairly complicated issue. And even with where they were making claims, if we go back to lockdown, originally the public health experts and Joe Biden and everyone got on and said, if you take the vaccine, you won't get it. False. And then they were saying, if you take the vaccine, you won't be able to transmit it. False. All sorts of factual claims they made, supported by the fact checkers, because all fact checkers do is refer to supposed experts, modelers. Right. And they only refer to supposed experts on one side of the political divide. Even a peer-reviewed journal like Lancet, like premium journal, they were censoring people on where the COVID started. Anyone who said it came out of the lab leak for 2 years was censored.
Mm.
Now, that censoring is not part of the scientific search for truth. It is part of a political agenda that they felt very uncomfortable about blaming China. Well, now the dominant view, because China destroyed all the evidence, we'll never know for sure, but the dominant view is the lab leak theory. Well, what a surprise, right? It just happens to emerge 20 feet away from the one sort of lab in the world that's doing this sort of work. It's just must have been a total coincidence.
But we knew all that very early on. You knew that there was this laboratory like 2 blocks away from the wet market where it had supposedly started. And we were asked as individuals, like, yes, the people who suggested that it came from the lab were censored. And yes, you were labeled a conspiracy theorist for even suggesting that. But we were asked to, suspend our disbelief for long enough to say, well, that is a coincidence. We were asked to understand that it is actually the world's greatest coincidence.
Do have a lot of time for Matt Ridley. He's a great science writer. And he early on said it couldn't come out of the lab leak, and it couldn't be. And he cited things like Lancet, and he cited things like top journals. And he said, look, they wouldn't be doing this. And he has since come around and said, no, it overwhelmingly was a lab leak. And he said, in retrospect, I just can't believe what they were doing. So he sort of said, the reason I didn't think at the time it was the lab is because what these top experts were doing. Well, now we know that Fauci was lining up experts to try to protect them, because it's very uncomfortable for someone like Fauci, who was funding gain of function research at this lab, to have the lab leak. And, of course, everyone understands you're trying to cover yourself. But so again, I have very little time for fact checkers. Now, it would be better if we lived in a world where you could put more confidence in people who have more knowledge. But, Jay Bhattacharya, who's got to be a top 5 epidemiologist, if you're in the game of credentialism, and to some extent that makes sense when you don't know anything else, but, his treatment and Sunetra Gupta's and Kuldorf, the Great Barrington Declaration. I mean, Bhattacharya says, in retrospect, the biggest source of disinformation through 2.5 years of COVID were governments and the public health caste. That is from one of the top credential guys in the world. Now, you're not going to hear that out of any of the sort of fact-checking elite, because the fact-checking elite are only left-wing. It's sort of like a version of O'Sullivan's Law. And so, yes, I have to say that I have less confidence in the credentialed elite than I did in 2019. And I think there's a lot of empirical reasons why we should have less confidence. When it comes to stuff I really know, like constitutional law, the RMIT people don't know. They're talking through their rear ends. They have no clue what they're talking about. We are predicting what judges will do in the future. And I think the weight of evidence leans towards judicial activism. Can anyone know for sure? No. And we are talking about how vigorous a future parliament will be in standing up to this sort of activist voice body. Can anyone know for sure? No. But I think the weight of evidence is that parliament will be pusillanimous. And for fact checkers to say, well, Jim's wrong because Robert French, the former Chief Justice, doesn't agree with him. Well, so what? Robert French didn't predict the Love case in 2020, where the judges just made stuff up out of their rear end based on otherness. So if anything, I think the weight of past practice by our top judges is in line with my views. And, I just don't see any reason why anyone would defer his or her judgment to some sort of second-rate constitutional people at RMIT. They don't know what they're talking about.
So, from what you're saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, it sounds like a lot of the problem, also harkening back to The Voice, is this idea that because the universities are captured and because the universities are the ones who are raising the next sort of generation of lawyers and judges and whatnot, that the problem is that because the universities are so captured by the woke left and this whole idea of identity politics and broadly increasing the public sector and bowing down to our statist overlord governments, Why is it that the universities are so captured, and is there any hope in kind of reversing that process?
Well, if you mean by captured that we have seen a trend towards ever less viewpoint diversity. So if you go back 50, 60 years, it was in the US, they got lots of data on this because political donations are public information. Maybe 55-45 for Democrats, 60-40. Today, it's well over 9-1. The elite Ivy League law schools, you tend to find slightly more Republicans because if they're going to be in the game, they might as well be somewhere. But even there, viewpoint diversity, there's whole areas of universities where you effectively can't find a conservative. Women's studies departments, Aboriginal studies department, sociology. Jonathan Haidt is a left of center Democrat. He's a psychologist. He documents this and he laments it. So he doesn't like it. He says we've got a real problem if students only get exposed to one point of view. It's not the most pleasant place to be if you're a right of center conservative, unless I've got a high appetite for confrontation and risk. Work risk doesn't really bother me. I grew up in a pretty vigorous Scots-Canadian household where everyone screamed at everyone and then you just forgot it, right? So I got a high, but a lot of people don't have that high appetite for it. And I came here with a chair, so I never had to worry about promotions. But if you got a family to feed, and it's just a simple fact that it's going to be harder for you if you're expressing right of center views indirectly. It'll be harder to get grants. There'll be people who take it personally. You're going to find it harder to get promoted. People self-censor. People tell me, they call me up and they say they're going to self-censor. This is a problem for our universities, and having someone go through and look at the codes of conduct and say, oh, we haven't got a free speech problem, completely misses the problem. The free speech problem comes because people self-censor and they worry about their job. And then when someone does speak out, like Peter Ridd, you get a ridiculous high court decision that pretends to value academic freedom and then says, well, the code of conduct wins because of a confidentiality thing, meaning that he effectively couldn't run his own defense in any way, if you buy that. You had to wait until you're completely fired. You couldn't get any money, and then you're supposed to be independently wealthy and hire a barrister and run judicial review proceedings, and then you can win. So again, the process is the punishment. And most people won't withstand that, so they just buckle. So we do have a big problem. Is it easy to fix? No, it's not. Look in the US, Niall Ferguson, the historian, not the crazy Imperial College Neil Ferguson modeling guy, but Niall Ferguson, who writes great historical stuff. He and some others have set up a university that tries to value free speech. It's called the University of Austin. It's just opened, but that's 1 out of 300 universities in the US. So when you look at the really elite US universities and in Britain, they are completely one-sided now. They're completely enthralled to identity politics. You might want to call it woke progressivism. Universities in Australia have 8 different flags flying full time. Conservatives just want the national flag, and we don't want to be berated. I put the problem down to a slow shift. It used to be tolerance if you come out of the religious wars in Europe, where Protestants and Catholics were slaughtering each other for 30, 40 years, they sort of eventually came to a compromise because it just wasn't working. And what tolerance meant was, in your principality, you can be Protestant or Catholic, we'll be what we are. And it's a sort of live and let live compromise. So tolerance meant you do what you want and we'll do what we want. But it did not mean, but I have to respect the choice you make, because I still think that your religious views are going to send you to hell, and you think mine are. So tolerance meant I'll sort of live and let live. And that's a workable compromise. That allows people to be polite and nice. But tolerance today is sort of transmogrified into this view that it's not just that you have to leave me alone. You have to respect my choices. You have to think I'm making good choices. And, let's be honest, a lot of the time I don't think they're making good choices, and neither do you guys. We think their choices are bad choices. Now, it's not, I don't care what they are, but this desire to make people genuflect and stand up and say, oh, your choices are so wonderful. That's not a tolerance that can withstand long-term pressure, because it's effectively forcing people to say things they don't believe. And in terms of free speech, it's almost worse to force people to say things they don't believe than it is to silence them. That's even worse in a way. So this new meaning of tolerance is this idea that, you have to respect the choices people make. Why? A lot of the choices they make, I don't agree with. Guys, I've got about 5 minutes tops. Let's wrap
perfect. We're about to wrap it up. We're at the hour mark. I was just going to say, and apart from just supporting the choices, we're also asked to support them financially. Is the other point, which is the extra layer of tyranny right on top of the nice tyrannical cake. We are at the hour mark, so let's wrap it up. Is there any last message, either Floyd or James, specifically on The Voice or on anything else that we've talked about today before we go?
Well, I think you need a cap, because I think the broadcast works better if you both sort of have the same outfit. I feel this is just a bit too independent.
He gets a cap. I get a skivvy. So
you've got the Ricky Fowler cap too, with a really pointed sort of.
I'm gonna pretend I know who that is. But I had one question for you, James. Simple yes, no. Is it worth going to university these days?
Depends what you take.
I'm not taking STEM or law.
Medicine?
Or medicine.
Or
Just
medicine.
if I'm interested in psychology or arts or business.
Look, I did a philosophy and math degree. So if you're lucky enough to go to a university that teaches old-fashioned philosophy or even history, it's a very worthwhile thing to do. But they just don't teach it that way anymore. They've been captured by identity politics and sort of anti-foundationalism when it comes to literary theory, that sort of thing. Social sciences are suspect, I have to say, and then some degrees are really awful. So it depends what you're taking. Engineering, solid, can't go wrong. Law is a credential, you're not gonna, so we've left some out. Accounting, can't go wrong. You're going to come out with a professional degree of sorts. Finance in the business school, I'm pretty skeptical about a lot of the business school offerings, but not finance. But again, keeps people off the unemployment roll, so the government likes it.
Mm-hmm. Yep, fair enough.
Yeah.
All right, we will wrap it up there. Thank you so much for joining us,
guys.
James. For those of us who don't already, you can follow us on Instagram, Spotify, YouTube, and Twitter. Thank you very much.
Share, subscribe.
We'll catch you next time.